I'm just going to turn it over to our Legislative and Political Director, Connor Kish, to give a quick update about our priority legislation and the status of the legislation.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody. I'm Connor Kish, the Legislative and Political Director for Sierra Club Virginia chapter. Thank you for taking some time to join us today. We are in the midst of a very hectic and virtual session, and a number of our priorities that we are trying to advance are advancing, and that's good news. So I just want to make everyone aware of a few of them. We are highly focused this session on tackling emissions from the transportation sector. And legislation to advance more clean vehicles is not yet being heard, but will be heard soon. Continues to be a top priority for our legislative committee and for the Sierra Club Virginia chapter as a whole. And obviously, the reason we've all tuned into this call today is to hear about another priority of the chapter, which is environmental justice, and various legislation bills surrounding that topic are also moving forward, including one that has advanced out of its first Senate committee. And is on its way to its second Senate committee. And there's also bills coming through the House that our great guest speakers, Tanisha and Steve, will be talking more about here in just a second. And then I want to touch on one other issue, which is the issue of interstate gas pipelines. The chapter is highly focused on two pieces of legislation to hold pipeline companies accountable and bring more oversight to the work that's being done by those companies with Virginia regulators. Virginia regulators lack some access and information that federal regulators have when it comes to these pipelines. And it's time for that to change so that Virginia's regulators are overseeing Virginia's water. So that is a third and critical component of what's being pushed in this very odd virtual legislative session. We continue to work really hard every day to make sure that these priorities are represented in committee, and continue to work really hard to make sure that the members of the committees that the bills are coming for hear from us and from Sierra Club members. So with that, legislation is progressing, and I want to turn it back to Tim, who will introduce some guest speakers to hear more about the environmental justice legislation that's being worked on. And there's no two better experts on that than Tanisha and Steve. So I will turn it over to them. Thanks, Tim.
Yep, I'll echo Connor's sentiments. We're very fortunate today to have several speakers representing different organizations and different perspectives on environmental justice. But before we get into our guests, let's just first just introduce them. So we have Tanisha Griffin from New Virginia Majority and Steve Fishback from Virginia Poverty Law Center. But to guide the top of our conversation is going to be the Sierra Club's own environmental justice community coordinator, Gustavo Angeles. So Gustavo, we'll go ahead and leave it up to you to just kind of give an overview about what environmental justice is and what it looks like in the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this conversation today about environmental justice. To start, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is environmental justice and give you a little scope of what happened at the legislature last year here in Virginia. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, of everybody, regardless of their color, race, national origin, or income. In the implementation, development, or enforcement of environmental laws and policies. With that in mind, and talking about last year, we, through working together at the Environmental Justice Collaborative, which is an organization that has several organizations fighting for environmental justice, we were able to pass some legislation in light that we will start moving Virginia forward in this direction to start looking for a fair treatment of everybody, in particular for these directly impacted communities. So with that in mind, last year we were able to pass what is called the Environmental Justice Act, which include a lot of definitions that they were not there in the code in Virginia before related with environmental justice, what is a community of color, what is a fence-like community, and all these definitions that will give us and put the pathway in order to start having and considering these issues that they were not looked before at all. So with that in mind, and acknowledging that we're still looking for the fair treatment of communities. As just to put an example, currently the law looking at permits, in particular through the Department of DEQ, DEQ meets with the permit applicants several times to customize and produce a permit. And the community is involved at the end when the permit is drafted and ready to be seen by one of these public boards, the water or air board usually. At that moment, they only request a comment of the communities or everybody to see what they think about the permit that is already drafted and being ready to approve. And by the way, permits it's seldom when they are denied. So this is at the moment that the communities are involved, and we don't like that. We don't think it's fair. There's not a fair treatment when the resources and the taxpayers that these community members are only have an opportunity to express their voice at the end. They are not having meetings for several months to see how this permit is going to be affecting them. So in light of that, and acknowledging that we already put some concepts on the law, this year we're coming back to see how we're going to do the implementation of these permits. And to talk about these and what are the specific things that we're looking forward to put in law this year, I'm going to pass it to Tanisha and Steve Fishback that they've been working through the collaborative on these bills. Tanisha.
Hey everybody, I guess I'll say it's almost afternoon, so good afternoon. I'm Tanisha Griffin. I'm the Environmental Policy Research Analyst in the Virginia Majority. We're a multi-issue, multiracial grassroots organizing and policy advocacy organization, and we operate along the Urban Crescent, Northern Virginia, Richmond, Hampton Roads area, really trying to build power among working class people throughout the state. So very happy to be here and talk about environmental justice with you all. Just to kind of piggyback on some things that Gustavo has already kind of shed a light on and kind of get us talking about what this legislation we're putting forth really tries to do. This legislation also really strongly comes out of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative, which is kind of a large grouping of several different organizations, advocates, and organizers really trying to push for environmental justice in Virginia at the policy level and at the grassroots level. But back to the legislation, one of the really important things that this effort that we're putting forth this year in the 2021 legislative session does is it specifically requires agencies, to create plans for integrating environmental justice into their operations. The bill we passed last year, as Gustavo noted, included definitions and made it a commitment of the state to advance environmental justice. But the meat of the bill really didn't make it through the legislature at that time. So we were like, we're going to come back and we're going to try to make sure that we have some explicit guidance for agencies for, getting them up and going on implementing environmental justice on the front end, not towards the end, as Gustavo was saying, when people start to realize concerns around environmental activities that may be arising in their local community. So very explicitly, one thing this bill really does, and this is the Omnibus Environmental Justice Bill carried by Delegate Simons, is it requires state agencies to create specific environmental justice plans, and that means having them identify the EJ communities that their environmental activities impact, having them think about their past activities and activities going forward and whether they have a disproportionate impact on certain communities, whether it be Black, Latino, Latinx, working class, immigrant communities, or certain areas that generally have been impacted by industrial activities, thinking about the cumulative impacts of those activities. And also creating some specific public participation plans ahead of time for how they're going to engage communities when environmental justice does arise. So it really requires agencies to do some premeditation on what environmental justice means and how their agency can specifically carry it out. So that's kind of one of the, big parts of the bill they're really hoping for, and really thinking that it'll help kind of get people engaged on the front end of environmental issues. Again, relating to what Gustavo said about when people typically get looped into a process, how we see that as being unfair and not meaningfully involving people and integrating their input into different situations, whether permitting or enforcement or what have you. And another thing that's a part of this legislation is an interagency working group. So at the federal level, the EPA already has a consortium of agencies that are supposed to be working together to advance environmental justice. And we're trying to mirror that on the state level, having agencies work together to, again, move forward those state agency plans, because we know that, activity that one agency does very well could affect another activity that another agency does. And there's going to be a need for collaboration if we're really going to address environmental justice and how it has affected communities throughout history in Virginia. And I know there's several stories that can be told about from today, to times past, about how environmental justice has affected folks in Virginia. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to bring up some certain examples going forward. But those are the two major pieces that we brought forth this session and we think can really create some change. And I'll pass it to Steve to talk about some other aspects of the legislation that kind of can address this issue of fair treatment and meaningful involvement in Virginia.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Fishback. I'm the litigation director at the Virginia Poverty Law Center. The Virginia Poverty Law Center is the state support center for all of the civil legal aid programs across Virginia. We do a lot of work in the legislature on issues affecting low-income Virginians, and environmental justice is definitely one of those issues. So I'm going to just talk about a little bit more detail about what's in the Omnibus Act. But before doing that, I just wanted to reference that the bill, there are two bills that contain the elements that Tynesha just spoke to. One of them is Senate Bill 1318 being carried by Senator Hashmi, and that contains the legislation around the state agency policy piece and the interagency work group. And as Gustavo mentioned, that passed the Senate General Laws Committee on a very close vote and is now headed to finance. So keep your eyes out of that. We don't have a hearing date yet. I'm going to talk more about the other two pieces of what we are calling the EJ Omnibus Act. That legislation is being carried by Delegate Simons. It's House Bill 2074. And in addition to the piece on state agency policies and interagency work group, it has two other pieces, which I'm going to describe. The first piece is directed towards DEQ and the Citizen Board's permitting authority. And the second piece is directed towards localities and their local planning commissions. So I'll get into them one piece by piece. So the first, the permitting section is direct, as I said, is directed to DEQ and its citizen boards. And it lists out a variety of environmentally destructive permit uses or activities that the bill will be directed to, such as landfills, sewage treatment plants, fossil fuel power plants, hazardous waste facilities. There are a total of 11 of them, these activities that this bill would apply to. And it does a number of things. First off, before an application a permit application can be submitted for any one of those 11 uses, the permit applicant has to get approved by DEQ or the Citizen Board, depending on which is hearing the permit. They have to get an approved public involvement plan, which is the way that the applicant proposes to engage the community and involve them in the permitting process. And so no application can even be submitted until that plan gets vetted publicly. There are notice requirements that have to be met to, for a public hearing about the public involvement plan. So again, that it's going to lengthen the permitting process in that regard. Once a permitting plan is been approved, then the applicant can submit its permit application. But in addition to the existing requirements as to what they have to submit, they're going to have to submit two other things. One is a cumulative impact analysis, which assesses how the proposed permit is going to incrementally change levels of pollution or other harmful environmental impacts, going forward. And the second thing it will have to submit, if the proposed activity is either in or could possibly affect an EJ community, it will have to submit an environmental justice analysis, which will identify both environmental and public health stressors that the proposed activity might exacerbate. So, so for like public health things, might it affect asthma rates, cancer rates, environmental stressors, obviously, discharge of toxins, noise, odors, etc. So once those documents are prepared, DEQ is going to have to put them out on the website along with all the permitting application, the permit application itself, and then there will have to be a public hearing on the permit application, which is to occur in the locality where the proposed use is going to take place. And then lastly, the bill also gives DEQ clear authority to deny a permit based on environmental justice or cumulative impact concerns. It also gives them the ability to approve a permit, even though there are those kind of concerns, so long as they attach conditions to the permit that are designed to minimize to the greatest extent possible any adverse cumulative impacts or environmental justice impacts. So that's the permitting part of the bill in a nutshell. It will radically change the way that permits are issued for some of these horrible land uses. The second piece is directed, as I said, to localities. It will require every locality to adopt as part of its comprehensive plan an environmental justice strategy. And the environmental justice strategy will contain a few things. One is an identification of where in the jurisdiction environmental justice communities are located. It will also require the strategy also must contain recommendations for policies to reduce pollution in those areas, to do other types of planning activities to enhance the environmental conditions in environmental justice communities, such as addressing issues of like food deserts, parks and recreation, etc. And it will also make recommendations for policies to increase public participation in decision-making related to environmental matters within the jurisdiction. So that's the bill. So happy to take any questions.
Great. So we just got a question from Lynn. Thanks, Lynn, for your question. It said, would the environmental justice pre-permit process being conducted by the applicant and not DEQ be problematic or a conflict of interest, which will influence the result of the analysis? As some context, Lynn said that we're experiencing that now with the Mountain Valley Pipeline with the air permit for the Lambert compressor station.
Well, all of those things still have to be publicly vetted. So in other words, the public participation plan will need to be publicly vetted. And if the applicant comes up with a bad public involvement plan, there's a process to try to improve it. As to and the same would hold true with the EJ and cumulative impact analysis. That too would be subject to DEQ approval, and advocates will be able to attack those, the sufficiency of those documents. We anticipate that there'll likely be some rulemaking to spell out more about the different elements that these new laws might require. We'll have to, advocates are going to have to use these processes to defeat them. One of the reasons that we did not put the onus on DEQ to do this was to avoid, or not avoid, because we're not going to be able to completely avoid. DEQ won't be able to say, hey, we don't have the resources to do this. They are going to have additional resources to do public engagement work and environmental justice, something or other. It's not really clear, but that was the reason it was done in that way. So if this were to pass, people should be, looking to attack those analyses if they are inadequate. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thanks for the question. And feel free to ask any other questions via the chat box. I am curious though, as well, we'll wait for other questions. What do you think is the most, where should advocates be focusing their resources to make sure that these bills are past the finish line right now? And that's a question for any of you.
Okay. I can go first and others can tag in. And I'll start with the bill that passed yesterday, and that's HB 1318 by Senator Hashmi. So we were happy to see that the bill passed last year. And we got some questions about cumulative impact and kind of how that would function, upon implementation. But, we were happy that it passed out of general laws. But we know that it's now going to Senate Finance, and that's where we're going to have to direct our attention, time, advocacy is going to be on that Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee. And I think that committee is going to, they'll meet, I think early next week, potentially, I think Tuesday or Wednesday. I have to double check the schedule. But that's where we're going to be focusing our advocacy and trying to explain better, which agencies is this really trying to target, and trying to discern, where we can find resources to support the legislation, and, make sure that not like last year, it also gets cut down again, for not having, financial, different financial support and resources, to put forth the different plans and interagency working group components.
I think it's important to just stay in touch about when these bills are coming up for hearing, because we're going to need people to testify. Actually, we had a very nice turnout for the hearing in Senate General Laws, and thank you for, if any of you were on, were testifying. But I think, as we move the permitting bill forward, it will be very important for people who live in communities that have been, suffered environmental injustice with the granting of permits, such as Charles City County, almost Buckingham, since it took a court to undo, the travesty of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the compressor station. But I think having stories to tell like this, to sort of highlight why we need these laws, would be very, very helpful. So if any of you are on, working in a community that already is suffering from environmental injustice, having you tell those stories would be of extreme help.
And I also want to note quickly that I know that different chambers have different advocacy pathways for the public to engage. So I think on the Senate side, I believe if you want to submit a written comment, it's good to send that information to the patron's office specifically. But on the House side, I know that folks can engage in the House Speak platform where they can submit written comments. But I still, tell people and suggest that they send that to the specific patron's office. The delegate or senator themselves. So they also get a copy ahead of time of the committee for, what you want to speak to them about related to the legislation.
By the way, we have at the Sierra Club, we create a app that if you add your information, it's a web page that we can contact you when these bills are going to be seen by the committee. So you can contact your legislator and talk to them about these bills. Thank you, team, for putting the link on the chat box.
Great. And yeah, I am curious. Steve mentioned, well, actually everybody mentioned that telling stories is one of the best things. I don't know, it used to be that you could just go in person and testify to a committee. And I don't know if anyone has any experience of like the logistics of this, of testifying to committees now. Is it easier, harder to do? Is it still kind of open to the public, or is it more limited given that we're in a virtual session?
In some respects, it's easier because you don't have to get to the Capitol and find where the hearing is. It also, like when it's live, you have to sit and wait. So a lot of people couldn't sit and wait, for several hours to testify because we don't know when during a committee's agenda the bill will be called. So for a long time, you may be sitting basically like this, just waiting for the bill to come up. It's important that before, another difference is that you need to pre-sign up to speak. And there are different, you got to know which committee the bill is in, and then there'll be sign-up information on that committee's website to pre-register. And then once the bill is called, you need to use the raise hand feature in Zoom to speak, and eventually someone will call on you. So that's sort of the difference. I don't know if Tynesha, you want to add anything, or Gustavo for that matter.
What I was going to add is that the other problem is that you need to have internet. And in several communities around the state, that's not something that is reliable. So it's really limiting the participation, although on one hand it's easier if you live in a metropolis, you don't have to drive to Richmond. On the other hand, people that are in the rural areas will have a hard time trying to stay connected or try to connect using the internet that usually is not reliable, or cell phone service that is not reliable either.
The last thing I'll flag is they also share call-in information with you as well. You can call into the Zoom. However, I wasn't able to understand how they would, because they ask you to use the raise hand feature in order to indicate that you want to speak, right? On Zoom, you have to click that button. And I didn't hear anyone get an opportunity to speak who may have called in, or how they would call upon them as well. So if you can hop on the Zoom, you have reliable internet, I would highly recommend that route if you want to speak. Because I'm not quite sure and haven't heard of anyone, having success when they have tried to call into the Zoom directly.
Great, and that's all good advice. Thank you very much for going over all of that, and thank you all for the work that you're doing. So now we're reaching towards the time limit break. We want to make sure that we gave our guest speakers some time to talk about any other legislation that they're really focused on, and what are the ways that people on this call can help.
And I know we talked about the Senate bill and where it was, but I also want to talk about the House bill, the HB 2047 by Delegate Simons, and where that at. So that's still yet to be heard by a committee. It has been referred to the House Agriculture Committee, and we're waiting for that to come up. So we anticipate it may come up next Tuesday, I believe. But again, we'll see what happens. And I believe there's only one more week where we could, the following week, if it was to come up, that would be probably the last opportunity for it to do so before it crossover when the bills go to each other chamber. So that's where that is right now. Again, same thing, reach out to folks on that agriculture committee, especially if you're constituent of the members that serve on it, and share your story, why you support the legislation, and why you think environmental justice is important.
It's HB 2074, not 47.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
all right. It's hard to keep these numbers straight. I'll just also point out that there's another set of bills that the administration proposed around permitting. That's House Bill 2221 being sponsored by Delegate Hayes, and Senate Bill 1373 being sponsored by Senator McClellan. We see that legislation as being largely complementary to our piece on permitting. So those are two other bills you may want to follow going forward.
And I don't know. Oh,
No, go ahead.
okay. I was going to flag two other bills. One is by Delegate, I think both of them are actually by Delegate Ayer. One is HJ 538, and that's called Access to Water Human Rights, and it very much vocalizes the importance of water, how it's a human right, and it sets out a lot of recommendations for how the state should think about water, how, what things we should not allow, a kind of abridgment should not be accepted when it comes to access to water. And there's one more piece carried by her. I would have to look. Oh no, it's HJ 542. Excuse me, and that's carried by Delegate McQuinn, and that centers on transit equity. And that's another environmental justice issue I know folks have been working on. And I think at this point, both of those have advanced forward on the House side.
And I actually thought of one more. I don't have the resolution number handy, but Delegate Lopez has introduced a resolution to add a constitutional amendment that will put environmental justice into the Constitution of Virginia. Very exciting. But unfortunately, I just don't have the link for that. But that's just another piece of legislation that people may want to keep track of.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for your time and just for your graciousness to talk about and share your expertise with us about what these bills mean and what we can do to help them. As I mentioned to everyone else on this call, this is a weekly endeavor. We will be doing these every Friday for session that at 11 a.m. It'll be about 30 to 45 minutes for this, but this one was really strong, and we really wanted to make sure that environmental justice was the first topic because just for far too long, there's been too many communities that have been left out on the cold or have been excluded or frankly targeted for polluting projects. And in order for the Commonwealth to be a better place for everybody, for every community, we need legislation like this. So, I thank you all on behalf of the Sierra Club and on behalf of all the advocates right now working on these things for everything that you're doing. And with that, I'll mention that we did post some more information into the chat box. If you want to go ahead and look through those, one of which is the add up, which is kind of a one-stop shop for all advocacy things on a particular topic. This one that we concluded was for environmental justice. We will be putting information about the statuses of these bills, but also opportunities you can to just click a button and send a quick pre-written message that you can add in a personal message to about these messages. The one that's on there right now is going to your particular state senator to support this legislation. We'll also be releasing action alerts that are related specifically to the Finance Committee, since that's where this bill is, where a lot of these bills are, or at least one of the most pressing bills right now is headed. So just keep an eye out. Staying engaged is the most vital part right now of this unprecedented and short session. And one of the first steps is here, listening to the folks that were on this call and just being willing to share your voice, because it really does make a difference. I think everybody on this call would agree that, even if it's just seemingly ordinary people, the more people we have voicing their support for this legislation, the more likely it is that this legislation crosses the finish line. So thank you again for tuning in. And with that, you can check this video out on Facebook Live. We'll also sending out an email with additional resources to all the attendees. So unless anyone else has anything to say, we'll close it out now. All right. Well, thanks again to Tanisha, Steve, Gustavo, and everybody else. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk soon. Have a good one.